Hello and welcome to week 3 of Mondays with Miss E. I'm going to be reading 2 chapters from Miss E this afternoon, and I'll start with my T-shirt this week. The first week I happened to be wearing my Book Bus T-shirt, and it made me think of all the book-related T-shirts I have, either book-related or Miss E or Cross Country, my other book. And so I have decided that I will try every week to wear a book-related T-shirt. So this week I have on my Bone Library T-shirt. I'm not actually sure where this shirt even came from. I think I got it from my daughter, but I don't know where she got it. And I always thought it was a cool shirt. It's got this book and it's got skulls on it. There's Bone Library, the bonelibrary.net is printed right on the bottom of it. So it wasn't until then that I looked it up and figured out what the Bone Library is all about. But the link is in the YouTube video, at the bottom of the YouTube video. So if you are curious about the Bone Library, check it out. So that's my book T-shirt for this week. So I'm going to be reading 2 chapters today. And they're both chapters that I think, for me, when I was writing this, really kind of helped me start to form Bets's character. And one thing that I was very conscious of when I was writing was that there's very little description of Bets in the book. And the book is written in first person. So she's not describing herself. She's just telling her story. And knowing that as I was writing, I knew that I had to make sure that a lot of her character came through, not in descriptions of her, but just in what she did and what she said, and especially because it's in first person, in kind of her thoughts, and her sort of introspection, and just sort of like a lot of times her second guessing herself as things are happening to her, how she's reacting to things, how she's actually reacting, but then at the same time, how she's kind of thinking about it, whether she lets on how she's feeling or not. We kind of get that as the reader. So these are 2 chapters that I feel were a good opportunity to do that, to now that the story has started, to really kind of get into what is this character like and what is this person like. So I'm going to jump in, and just to kind of catch us up from last week. Remember, we ended last week with this assignment in history class, where the teacher had taken the classroom and covered the walls with 100 photographs that he said were, in his mind, famous or important. I think he said important Americans. And the assignment was for the classes to figure out who these people were. So that's where we pick up this week. The first chapter is called Delivery. The rest of the school day was uneventful, other than the new social order that was established by the time we made it to lunch. If someone was in your history class, they were your friend. Although we weren't quite ready to sever ties completely, friends in other history classes were on shaky ground. Thankfully, Susan didn't have Mr. Flynn for history, so I didn't have to avoid her. She came looking for me after lunch to find out why I wasn't in our usual meeting spot. And when I filled her in, she offered help if she could. There were also quite a few history textbooks brought outside for lunch, but it didn't take us long to confirm that Mr. Flynn marched to his own drummer when it came to choosing historical figures. Other than Lincoln, Einstein, and Roosevelt, none of the other people were in there. At least, if they were, their picture didn't make the cut. Mr. Flynn's crazy, Why does he ask us about stuff that's not in the book? Lots of stuff's not in the book. Like what? Vietnam's not in the book. Vietnam's happening right now. It's not history. What else? 97 famous Americans aren't in the book. Similar conversations were taking place all over campus. Either frustration at Mr. Flynn for giving us the assignment, or frustration at the textbook for leaving out seemingly important people. In the first month of school, I'd trudged through 4 chapters of the textbook and couldn't remember any of it. Something told me I was going to come down in favor of Mr. Flynn's version of American history. Our first visit to the library didn't reveal any new names, but those who were able to stop by after school agreed it was a step in the right direction, and we were happy with what we'd found. The library had a large biography section, intimidatingly large at first, but after looking at just a few books, we realized most had a picture of their subject on the front cover. So we knew just by sliding the book out of its slot whether it was one we needed to flip through. We assigned shelves to each person in our class, and each agreed to return as soon as they could to scan their section. We also discovered that the reference section of the library did not circulate books. This was a comforting thought, since any of the other classes could sabotage our efforts with a plain old library card, find an important book, and check it out so it wasn't there for the other groups to use. As quickly as we'd thought of the strategy, we realized it could be used on us. We did see a few people from other classes at the checkout desk and eyed their books suspiciously, but how could we accuse them of doing anything wrong? To anyone not in one of Mr. Flynn's classes, they just looked like a couple of studious kids with an interest in history. We thought the non-circulating books on American history might end up being our best resource, but decided to attack the biographies first. I knew I had a few deliveries to make for Johnson's, so I said my goodbyes and promised to be back at the library the next day. When I walked into the store, Mr. Johnson was talking with a regular customer. "Don't know. She never has before," I heard Mr. Johnson say as I grabbed the clipboard from its hook on the wall and started to fill a box with the first order. The woman in front of the counter was talking in a low voice, so the conversation was more like listening to someone talk on the phone. I didn't really care anyway, since I was still thinking about the contest in history and the possibility of a trip to San Francisco. Ordered the same stuff she usually comes in to buy. Could be, but she didn't sound sick on the phone. Just seemed her regular crabby self. Don't really matter one way or another as long as the bill gets paid. Then Mr. Johnson noticed me down the aisle and called me up to the counter. "Elizabeth, got a delivery here for you that needs to go out today. Bit of a trip, so best take care of it first. It's already boxed and ready to go." He handed me a slip of paper with the address on it, but it wasn't a street I knew, and there was no name. Mr. Johnson must have read the confusion on my face. "You'll want to take Route 116 about 2 miles out of town. You'll see a narrow dirt driveway on your right. That'll take you by the house. Only house on it, so you can't miss it." I reached for the box, but Mr. Johnson was resting his hand on it. So I stayed frozen there for a moment, like we were playing tug-of-war with it. "Your mother okay with you riding that far out of town?" I shrugged off the question and nodded, but the look in Mr. Johnson's eyes told me he wasn't really worried about my mother. I left the store confused, but once I was on my bike, I let my mind wander and enjoyed the scenery on the outskirts of town. I found the dirt road right where Mr. Johnson said it would be, and I only had to bike on it for a minute or two before I came to the top of the hill and saw a farmhouse and barns nestled in the field just ahead, and there, parked in front of the house, was the red pickup. My bike skidded in the dirt and stopped amid a dusty cloud. Now I understood the conversation in the store, Mr. Johnson's hesitation, and the slip of paper with no name. I was delivering groceries to Miss E. I stood straddling my bike in the middle of the road, deciding what to do, but there really wasn't that much to decide. People in town seemed to step out of her way, and no one really knew much about her, but I certainly wasn't going to turn around and head back to Johnson's because I was afraid to deliver groceries to an old lady. I put my feet back on the pedals, coasted down the hill, and came to a stop next to the pickup. A peek inside gave me that eerie step back in time feeling again. The interior of the truck was in perfect shape, just like the outside, old and outdated, and at the same time, new like yesterday. The house, on the other hand, was clearly from a time long gone. It looked like it was painted white once, but the slivered wooden siding had long since shed the paint and faded to a dull silvery gray. And through the screen door, I could see an entry hallway, but looking in from the bright day, the rest was shadowy. With the box of groceries tucked under one arm, I raised my other hand to knock on the screen door when I noticed the envelope stuck between it and the door frame, but didn't bother counting them. Mr. Johnson never told me what the total was for the groceries I delivered. Some customers gave me money, others didn't and must have an account. I just delivered and didn't ask. I peered through the screen door again, then looked back at the envelope, and then at the box of groceries under my arm. I bent down to place the box on the porch, and when I did, my face came close enough to the screen that the bright sunlight was blocked out and my eyes started adjusting to the dark. I saw further down the hallway, stairs going up, a doorway into another room, maybe a formal sitting room from the looks of the high chair back and rug on the floor. I could hear faint music, something old and scratchy. Looking through the screen gave a texture to everything I could see, like standing a little too close to a painting and seeing the lines of the brushstrokes instead of the scene the artist intended. And like a painting, everything was still, a captured moment in time. Then I noticed a hand move onto the arm of the chair, the fingers bouncing lightly to the music. I was so intent on peering into the house, my face was pressed against the screen, and my hands were leaning on the door. When I saw the movement on the chair, I jumped back, and the screen door came with me, snapping closed a second later with a bang. My feet were frozen on the porch. The envelope was still clutched in my hand, and my mouth hung open as wide as my eyes. My jump back landed me in the sunlight again, so I could no longer see inside, but I could still hear the music playing, and above that came a voice, calm but forceful enough that I could hear it clearly from outside the house. "Note said to just leave it." My mouth hung open in reply, but nothing came out. My feet stepped slowly backward, and I somehow navigated the porch steps in reverse. I threw a leg over my bike and was back on the main road before I knew it. My head cleared as I pedaled back toward town, and I replayed the incident on the farmhouse porch. I wondered how many kids in school even knew where Miss E lived, let alone had actually been there. Granted, I hadn't actually been in the house, but based on Cassie's curiosity when we saw Miss E in town during the summer, I was guessing the front porch was a lot further than most kids had gotten. I was already planning the story I'd tell next day in school when I realized the story also included a rather embarrassing backward scramble between front porch and bike. I was willing to admit to myself that the sight of an old lady's hand and the 5 words she spoke to me from inside her house to keep the story to myself. I hopped off my bike and walked back into Johnson's to start boxing the next order. And Mr. Johnson looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Everything okay with the delivery?" he asked as I handed him the envelope. "Sure," I said. "What could go wrong?" I must have managed to hide my mix of embarrassment and excitement because Mr. Johnson only nodded and turned back to the book he used to keep track of accounts. All right, the next chapter is called Routine Revival. I'm part of it. Everyone in my history class got to room 110 early so we could scan the pictures again and check them against anything we'd found the previous afternoon. We were now up to 16 names, and even though things had slowed down after knocking off the easier ones in the first few weeks, we were still getting 1 or 2 a week. We weren't sure exactly where the other classes were, but We felt good about our progress. And on the Miss C front, a trip out Route 116 had become a part of my regular weekly delivery schedule. Each time the envelope was sticking out from the screen door, and each time I just left the box without lingering or trying to look inside the house again. I guess Miss E had decided I'd learned my lesson on the first delivery. There were no instructions on any of the other envelopes. Mr. Johnson was obviously curious, and my return was always met with an attempt on his part to strike up a conversation. I never let things lead anywhere, though, and responded to his statements about the weather or the nice views outside of town with a simple yep or an uh-huh. At that point, I didn't really have a secret to keep, but I felt special since out of everyone in town, I was really the only one who had set foot on Miss E's farm since anyone could remember. So acting like I knew something made me feel like someone special, even though I didn't really know any. I didn't really know any more than anyone else in town, except that Missy liked listening to old records and that two of the boards on her front porch squeaked. So what was out of the ordinary a few weeks ago had become my day to day, and I was feeling like things were back to normal until the afternoon of the fight. On the friend front, Cassie had been avoiding a boy on the day I had met her, and he was still paying her more attention than she was interested in getting from him. Peter Anderson had set his sights on Cassie at the end of their freshman year, and he wasn't giving up, despite Cassie's consistent refusal to go to the movies with him or to let him walk her home and carry her books. Even though Forestville was too small to avoid someone entirely, she had an easier time of it over the summer, since she could go wherever she wanted and usually went in the opposite direction when she saw him. But once school started back up, it was harder to avoid him. He had learned her schedule and knew where he had to hang out to run into her between classes. Cassie had changed her route to try and avoid him, but there were only so many ways you could get from point A to point B. When she did run into him, he would trail after her, trying to strike up a conversation, complimenting her on her outfit, and generally being a pain. He was also ruining her chances with any other boy, since they were walking down the halls together so often, people just started assuming they were dating. By the time we'd made it to November, Peter was causing some real problems. In her attempt at avoiding him, Cassie was trying more elaborate routes to her classes and was ending up tardy more often than not. She knew the class changes when she was likely to run into Peter and spent so much time worrying about getting to her next class, she couldn't concentrate on the one she was in. All of this came to a climax outside the auditorium building a couple weeks after I'd started delivering to Miss E. Cassie was part of a drama club production and was on her way to practice. Peter knew her practice schedule and had started lingering outside the building waiting for her each afternoon. I was on my way to the library, and knowing that she was probably going to cross paths with Peter, I offered to walk with her to practice. As predicted, Peter was waiting by the auditorium building doors as we approached. He looked at ease, half leaning against the side of the steps, his legs stretched out in front of him, and his hands stuffed into his pockets. Some of the boys had started letting their hair grow longer, imitating the musicians we admired and the older college students who had started making their way into the news for the trouble they were stirring up over Vietnam. Peter had joined the trend, and his hair hung down in his eyes, so he had to push it to the side to see. When he did, he saw us and called to Cassie. She gave him a short reply about being late for practice, but as usual, Peter didn't take no for an answer. He stepped in front of her and peppered her with questions about movies and parties that weekend. She tried to get around him, but each time he anticipated her dodge and moved to block her way. I don't really know why I got involved. I walked to class with Cassie whenever we were headed in the same direction, and I'd encountered Peter's persistence before. I found it annoying and awkward and felt sorry for Cassie, but I never really took it personally until that day in front of the auditorium. Maybe I was frustrated by our lack of recent progress in history. Maybe I was just irritable from the cold I was fighting, or maybe it was the gap in letters from my father. Whatever prompted it, the injustice of what Peter was doing to Cassie finally hit home and felt personal. Hey! I shouted, and when there was no response, I took a step forward so there was no question about who I was talking to and shouted again. The second time, Peter took notice and stopped pestering Cassie long enough to turn toward me. Leave her alone. She's not interested in you and is tired of you stopping her between classes. Get away from her and stay away. There was a blank expression on Peter's face as he processed what I'd said, and he was clearly surprised at my verbal attack. Then I saw his eyes dart side to side, getting in a quick count of the bystanders who had witnessed the exchange, and I understood immediately where Peter was coming from. It wasn't just about being interested in Cassie. Tagging along after a girl for the last 2 months, Peter had put himself at risk of being labeled as the kid who got dumped before the first date, and I just pointed a spotlight at him. But he was used to fending off Cassie's protests, so he quickly recovered and turned things his way. A smile grew across his face. Ah, that's so cute, sticking up for your friend. Or maybe you're jealous. I see you around. I see you a lot with her in the halls. You getting tired of me asking her out instead of you? Well, there's a good movie showing this weekend if you're interested. That's as far as he got. I didn't really think about punching him. I just felt a shift from feeling sorry for Cassie and being aggravated at the delay on my way to the library to being overwhelmingly angry at the kid in front of me. Angry at how he was messing things up for Cassie, but mostly angry at how he was talking to me. Like I'd be honored to spend time with him. Of course, I thought about all this after, mostly while I was sitting in the principal's office. In that instant, what I was really thinking about was just hitting Peter's face with my fist as hard as I could. And I did. He was won by a girl was the last thing on his mind. My fist came up from his left, hitting him on the side of his face just under his cheekbone. He actually spun around like he was in some cartoon. And when he faced me again, his expression had gone from confident smugness to a mixture of surprise and unconsciousness. Peter's mouth hung open and his eyes widened. Then his eyelids flickered and closed while his body slumped to the ground. What came next was a blur. I heard a girl's voice cry out, probably Cassie's. A couple of boys who were standing around watching let out what could have been a cheer or a yell of surprise. People who were nearby went running to tell others, and those who were further away came running up to see what had happened. But the crowd gathering around me was peripheral. My attention had been entirely focused on Peter's face, and when he took a nosedive for the pavement, allowing me to see beyond the space he'd just occupied, what I saw was the red pickup parked at the curb. The window was rolled down, and Missy was leaning on the door, looking right at me, almost like she knew Peter would be knocked out of the way and sat there waiting for the chance to look me in the eye. She lifted her head upward in a funny sort of nod that seemed only to go up and now down again. Not a nod of approval, more like a nod that just said, hey, I see you, got my eye on you. Then her face disappeared from the window, replaced by an elbow resting on the door, and she threw the truck into gear and drove away. I just stood there and watched it go, my head slowly pivoting until the truck disappeared behind one of the school buildings. Then my attention snapped back to the scene around me. There were a lot of people. Fights weren't all that common at El Molino, I guess, so any scuffle drew attention. Bonus if the fight involved a girl, especially one who just knocked a kid a foot taller than her to the pavement. Most people were just standing around, still trying to figure out what had happened. Some were hunched over Peter to see if he was okay. Others were comforting Cassie, probably thinking she was upset because the boy they assumed was her boyfriend had been hurt. No one really came up to me, although most were sneaking glances in my direction. I did see a few girls hiding smiles and nodding approvingly, one bold enough to look me in the eyes and throw a quick thumbs up, partially hidden against her chest. Cassie finally shook off the shock and rushed over to hug me. Sorry, I mumbled into her hair, not because I'd hit her boyfriend like half the people gathered around thought, but because unless you're a football jock or a prom queen, no one in high school likes having the spotlight on them. I didn't just put it on Peter with one swing, I'd put it on all three of us. Cassie shrugged. At least Peter Anderson won't be bothering me in the hallways again, she said with a half smile. At least not while you're around. We shared a quick, uncomfortable laugh, then covered our mouths, both realizing that laughing while standing over still knocked out Peter didn't make us look so good. Someone had gone to get a teacher. There was a shout from the direction of one of the other buildings, and everyone scattered. Cassie and I were left standing over Peter, who conveniently came to as the teacher arrived on the scene. What's going on here? The teacher questioned, while catching his breath and looking around for Peter's attacker, someone bigger and stronger, someone with enough muscle to knock him to the ground. Peter shook his head as if to clear it and managed to croak out, She hit me! The teacher still looked around at the retreating students before Peter's words sunk in. Finally, he turned to me. You hit him? He asked, looking like the facts still didn't add up. He's constantly bothering Cassie, I blurted out. He's a pain. He's always... Peter started to interrupt, but I took a step toward him and he scrambled to his feet and scurried away from me. The teacher pretended to brush an inch on his nose in order to hide a smile. Well, you'll need to come with me then. I fell in line behind him and he marched me inside. I can't say much about the principal's office because nothing really happened there. I suppose the principal didn't know what to do with a girl who had beat a boy in a fight. He asked a few questions and then he had me wait outside his office. I tried to explain about the problems Peter was causing for Cassie, but he didn't want to hear any of that. Mostly, I think what he wanted was to get rid of me and the problem that had landed on his desk just as he was getting ready to go home. But he needed to do something, and that something was to call my mother. I sat waiting until my mother arrived. Her response was simple. She told me that my father wouldn't approve. That was it. She was neither upset nor not upset. Her only reaction was to let me know what my father's reaction would have been. Our car ride home was silent, not because of silent disapproval, but because my mother was responding to my fight the same way she'd responded to my father's leaving for Vietnam, or anything else for that matter. No response at all. I welcomed the silence as a chance to replay the afternoon's events in my mind. Not the fight, but rather the red pickup truck and its driver sitting there watching me. For a woman who had kept to herself for as long as anyone in town could remember, I was certainly seeing my fair share of Miss E. All right, that is the reading for today. If you want to jump into the discussion, the link is on the video, on the bottom of the video, and the Bone Library link is there as well if you want to check that out. I hope you enjoyed today's chapters, and I'll see you next week.